and welcome to this week's episode of A Focus On with myself, Fifi Peters. Today, we're coming to you from the Investing in Africa Mining Indaba that is marking 30 years of providing a platform for business and government to engage on key issues affecting the mining sector. In this week's episode, we are speaking with Shirley Weber. She is the head of coverage for resources and energy over at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. Just as the Investing in Africa Mining Indaba celebrates 30 years, of which you have been an attendee for a good 20, just your reflections on where we're coming from and where we currently stand.
No, thank you. We've seen a few changes happening. I think the immediate aspect is ESG. 10, 20 years ago, the focus on ESG has never been so big. And obviously that's related to climate change. I think that's one big thing. The second difference is that it's not just precious metals and base metals anymore. There's a focus on energy, minerals and metals. In other words, the whole energy transition that can help, the metals that can help that. And the third thing that we've also seen is that there's a bigger focus on Africa because we do have a lot of resources sitting here. And the world is going to need that in future if they're going to do their decarbonization implementation. So three big things that I've seen over the last few years. So that's quite exciting actually for Africa.
Certainly, but if we also talk about the decarbonization, as it were, if we zone in on that, I mean, the countries like Zambia and the DRC are getting a lot of attention right now because of the large deposits of these critical minerals that they hold, from the copper to the cobalt. Just a reflection maybe on the changing needs of the clients also that you have been servicing over time and what the expectations are from them now that there is this push for the mining industry and mining companies to increase their assets of these critical metals to help not only themselves transition, but of course the rest of society.
I think all of our governments must realize that they need political stability to be in place now, because everyone wants that investment, for economic growth, to increase employment in those countries as well. But there's a big gap in Africa. The infrastructure is lacking, and we're talking about rail moving the ore, to where it should go to. There's also a problem on, for example, power generation. It must be on the renewable side that there should be a focus on, because it can't just be your traditional energy generation anymore. So I think those two aspects is important. And then maybe the third thing that we should be focusing on is also beneficiation in some sort of way in many of those countries.
Talking about that, I was reflecting on my own career and reflecting on the fact that 15 years ago, countries and companies were talking about the importance and the urgency to beneficiate 15 years ago. 15 years later, it still remains the same. And one has to question just by how much we have moved the dial when it does come to the beneficiation debate. Perhaps just your reflections there on what is new in the subject area.
I think we're still lacking behind. From 5, 6, 7 years ago to now, I don't think we've actually moved forward a lot. And I'm talking about the African continent specifically. The one country that has been successful is really on the Botswana side, beneficiation of diamonds, cutting and polishing. That's created, and everyone agrees that there's a purpose to beneficiation, alleviating poverty, increasing employment, economic growth, but it must be done responsibly, a phased-in approach. And I don't think any of our African countries can actually do it alone. We need those partnerships to come into play. We need capital investment to happen, and maybe regional beneficiation hubs could be a very good solution.
Because what you're seeing right now is to increase the pace of value add within their country. Certain countries are implementing export bans, saying that you can no longer export a certain metal or mineral in its raw form. It needs to go out the country once it is beneficiated already. has been a bit unpopular. It has been greeted with quite a bit of resistance. But just your thoughts on whether export bans are the way to go.
I think export bans are not the way to go. It must be done in a manner where it makes sense for the country in the phase that the country is in. If we have the ore body there, extracting it is one thing. Processing plants, infrastructure, rail, all of that actually is lacking. And we need investments there. So if we've got the green metals, capital will follow that sustainability. So we will be able to get, investors in. So I don't think we should have a complete ban on exports. It should be let's do the first part of processing in the country if we have the infrastructure set up, or at least trying to build up the infrastructure, and then move on to maybe the second part can be done in another African country. So if an export ban is to the rest of the world, but we can actually facilitate it within the boundaries of the various African countries, maybe that's a solution. But a complete ban currently with a lack of infrastructure, I think is not wise.
What about the role of lenders then, such as Absa and your groups or your peer groups in the sector in advancing progress around beneficiation and also advancing progress around shortening the infrastructure gap that you still speak about? What appetite is there for lenders such as Absa to play a role there?
I think on the African continent, we are very supportive to ensure that we look at ore bodies, that meets our criteria from a due diligence point of view, the equator principles, because most of them would become a project finance, mining transaction. So what is very important to that, we could link the renewable energy to that project. We can also, over time, finance the processing that goes with it, but it's all got to do with efficiency. Is it cost efficient to have a processing plant that must be set up at a huge expense instead of maybe moving it, and not necessarily abroad, somewhere else where another processing plant's already happening, on the African continent. So I think it's a very sensitive subject that is going to be addressed in future. But time and governments and partners' willingness to actually make the country a success, to create that economic growth, that's going to be very important.
Okay, so let's park the beneficiation story there for now, and maybe also just reflect on the dynamics happening in the sector. I think a lot of people have been quite aware, I'm sure your clients as well, about the fact that there has been a significant softening in the commodities basket, particularly from the pandemic highs and also some of the highs that we saw at the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. Your assessment of the commodities basket now as we throw forward to 2024, and what kind of activity do you expect to see?
Look, there's definitely a cycle where we're in again. And I think we all understand that commodities are cyclical. So we need to appreciate that, diversification is going to be important for all mining entities, because if copper goes down, platinum will go up, and, wherever we are. So regional diversification, commodity diversification, and ensuring that in good times that capital is spent responsibly, because you can't just do it anymore, because the volatility is actually becoming a bit more frequent. That's how it feels, with the many years that I've dealt with in the mining space. So I think the responsibility there becomes to management, to the sponsors of projects, to be sensible in that. So that's what I think. How long is the cycle going to be? Depending on the commodity, but clearly there's a pressure on the PGM basket as we speak. But at least it's also a metal that's needed, for the transition. So, yes.
You spoke about diversification and diversification outside of commodities that certain mining companies do mine. Of course, what's driving the diversification right now is the transition, and it has been interesting to see players in gold for instance, trying to increase the exposure a lot more in the likes of copper. What are you seeing on the bank's front in terms of appetite for doing deals? And what have you heard here at the Indaba?
So there's going to be a lot of activity in the M&A space. I think if we look at precious metals or base metals, I think they will be lower down the list from an mergers and acquisition point of view. I think the critical mineral space, you know, like the graphite, the lithium, the vanadium, the rare earths, especially where other continents need, for example, the greener minerals and metals, they will come in with strategic equity partner proposals to buy a certain portion, you know, of shareholding of those smaller mining type of projects in order to get the offtake for where it's needed. So I believe that is going to happen, and there's interest. There's interest from China, there's interest from the Middle East coming into Africa, and clearly the US is always interested, in those, especially because they've released their critical minerals list as well. So I think there will be activity, but not like necessarily the big deals that we've always seen, like in the gold space or in the platinum space.
Do you, on a final note then, ever expect to see such big deals in the near future? And in your view, what do you reckon it would take for that to happen?
So I do think in the next 2 to 3 years, because everyone is moving towards their 2030 targets to try and decarbonize by doing diversification in their portfolios. I think it will be, quite an active part of the continent, and there's pockets. So, for example, if you look at where lithium is, where you would look where graphite is. So it's going to take 2 to 3 years, I think, before we see real activity in that specific space.
Now, I imagine that Shirley and I will have a lot to discuss throughout the 2 to 3 years as we continue to see Africa's mining sector evolve. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and it's goodbye.